All righty, let's get started. Today is Thursday, September 30th. We have been covering a lot of really dense material. We are going to continue to cover a lot of dense material today, finishing off the endocrine system. And like I said, I appreciate that it can be a little overwhelming. It's a lot of information, but I will also remind you that today is the last day where you're getting new information from me. And the exam is 1 week from today. That doesn't mean you get to take 6 days off and then you get to study your butt off for the exam. It just means that you have a lot of time to process and make sense of this information. So that is definitely a good thing. So that is our game plan for today. Remember, if you've not done so already, please by Friday by 6 p.m. Turn in your group outlines. Make sure it has everybody name in your group, just one per group. It has your topic and has your references. And again, please make sure that is on time. Late or missing outlines lose 10 points of the 50-point assignment. So please, 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 I can't emphasize enough. Do not forget, remember to turn this in on time. So that I can post those tomorrow evening, and you will have them then all weekend to look at for your Tuesday group presentations. And then, like I said, Thursday, we have our lab and lecture exam. All right, questions on that? All right, we left off our last class and we were working our way through our glands and our hormones and talking about the targets, effects, and how they're regulated. So we had talked about all the introductory stuff for the endocrine system. And so we had gotten to the meats and potatoes. And in particular, we had done the hypothalamus and the anterior and posterior pituitary, which are the big major controlling glands of our endocrine system. But there are a lot of other glands that produce hormones. And in fact, the more this is studied, the more we're learning that many cells that we don't expect produce hormones. Again, now that our definition of hormones have changed, right? Before it was just those long-lasting chemical signals that got in the blood and went everywhere. But now that we understand that they're autocrine and paracrine hormones, we are seeing that a lot of tissues, a lot of cells use local chemical signals to coordinate local activities. And so there's a lot more to hormones than we understand. But we're going to talk about and focus on the big ones. One of the big ones is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is this two-lobed structure. So as you can see, there are two big lobes. Oh, that's what I need. Two big lobes that are held together by a narrow structure known as an isthmus. When we look at this illustration, and they've done a nice job of showing it, and you can see this histologically as well. When you look at this under the microscope, you can see that each lobe is divided up into individual tiny little lobules. These are clusters of hormone producing cells that are separated by a connective tissue septum, compartmentalizing them into a bunch of tiny little pieces. This is see how clever I am. Not. Okay, let's do this. On that virtual anatomy lab, again, remember, as we talked about, there is an endocrine system and where it shows some hearts, but some of these things you need to be tricky on. I think for this one, we want to actually look at the digestive charts, because the digestive chart is the one that shows us the head. And in particular, what I want to point out to you is this posterior view. Pretty sure we saw it. No, did we not see it? All right, if it's not here, maybe it is in the endocrine. Where would that be? Thyroid, maybe? There we go. That's the picture I want. Here we see a posterior view of the oral and nasal cavity. We'll talk about this when we get to the respiratory system as well, because this is going to be an important structure, this larynx. that we're going to talk about. But what I wanted to show you is that sitting beneath the larynx, here from the posterior view, we see, again, the two lobes of the thyroid gland. So it really is kind of a C-shaped structure that sits in the front with the isthmus holding the two lobes together, and it is open on the back. The other reason I'll show this to you now is you can also see very clearly, hopefully very clearly, that there are these additional structures that are sitting here on the back of this. So I've kind of highlighted them here, but now I'm going to clear all those drawings so that you can see them, and I'll just point an arrow at them. So here, here, and here, you can see these little nodules sitting on the back of the thyroid gland. Any idea what those little nodules might be?
The lobules.
Not a bad guess. They're not lobules in this case. This one doesn't do a good job of showing the lobules. It actually, there we go. Samuel's got it. It's actually a completely different gland. That completely different gland that is adjacent is actually the parathyroid gland. Now, again, we see here, it is varies from person to person, somewhere usually between 4 and 12 of these little cluster-like structures that we see. Many of them, like these, are actually found on the thyroid gland, but occasionally they can actually be found on the musculature of the esophagus or in some of the other surrounding connective tissues as well. While this is on the thyroid gland, as we'll see when we talk about it, it is a completely different gland with a completely different structure, and not surprisingly produces a completely different hormone. So while we were here, I wanted to talk about that, but we'll focus for right now on the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland isn't something you can really palpate and feel with your hand. However, what you can feel with your hand is your Adam's apple. Your Adam's apple is this enlargement of the larynx and this big, huge piece of cartilage that it forms the majority of the larynx is called the thyroid cartilage because it's just superior to the thyroid gland. So you can feel that enlargement of the thyroid cartilage, but not the thyroid gland that is beneath it. The thyroid gland is somewhat of a unique endocrine gland in a couple of ways. The first is in the quantity of the hormone that it produces. Well, one of the things that makes the thyroid so distinct, as we see nicely in this illustration, is that there are these follicles that are formed by simple cuboidal cells. The simple cuboidal cells are the follicular cells. They're forming this follicle. And they are the ones that are responsible for making, storing, and releasing the hormone. Well, that's not surprising that we have a gland that makes, stores, and releases. However, what's unique about the thyroid gland is how the hormone is stored. Rather than storing the hormone within the cells itself, it stores the hormones in these fluid-filled follicles. So this colloid substance is this solution that is just chock-filled with the thyroid gland hormones. These thyroid hormones, or I should say it this way, the thyroid gland contains months worth of these thyroid hormones. Now, again, that seems like an excessive amount of hormone to be storing within these cells, within these follicles. So that must mean it must be a pretty important hormone. And indeed it is, right? There are two main specific types, the, again, class of hormones that is stored here are what are known as the thyroid hormones. But there are primarily two specific thyroid hormones. They are thyroxine and triiodothyronine, which you absolutely positively have to spell out. However, if you were writing an essay question or something like that about it, after you've written them out once, then you may abbreviate them T3 and T4. These are amino acid based. Again, it's not the cortex of the adrenal gland. It's not the kidney. It's not the reproductive gonads. But what's interesting about this particular amino acid hormone is that it's lipid soluble. It's able to easily pass through the plasma membrane and get inside of the cell. Since it can get inside of cells, how many cells do you think it can affect?
All of them?
Yeah, damn near all of them. Absolutely. It can have a huge effect on most of the cells of our body. And notice thyroxine and triiodothyronine get their names T3 and T4 because of the number of iodine molecules that they contain inside of it. Iodine is a vital part of our diet. One of the things that they were finding as they were collecting in ancient times, medical information about the people in our environments, we are finding that iodine, which is a not natural occurring substance in many regions, in the soils of many regions, but not all regions. There were some areas where some populations weren't getting as much iodine as others. And without that iodine, you cannot produce these thyroid hormones, and that can cause major developmental problems. So how did we as a nation resolve this?
Put it in salt?
Exactly. It's pretty much impossible these days to buy salt that doesn't have iodine inside of it to provide that. Excellent. Now, as we mentioned, again, being lipid soluble, having so massive amounts of it, not surprisingly, it affects most of the cells of the body. And its job is to maintain and increase the metabolic rate of those cells. This can affect things as simple as blood pressure and body temperature, but it can also affect things like growth. It can also affect things like overall body metabolism, energy levels, all sorts of things like this. I believe we have at least one, maybe two groups that are doing some type of either hyper or hypothyroidism. I don't remember all the groups, but obviously someone, so again, I don't want to steal too much thunder, but someone who has hypothyroidism underproduces these hormones. And because they underproduce these hormones, they tend to be very lethargic. They tend to be small in stature and size, have very low energy levels, and have problems with their immune response and things along those lines. Whereas conversely, someone who has hyperthyroidism, what happens to them?
The opposite.
The opposite. They actually tend to grow very, very large, very rapidly. In fact, in the Guinness Book of World Records, I think it's 7 of the 7 most tallest people ever in the history of the world that's been noted in the Guinness Book of World Records are all individuals who have hyperthyroidism. With hyperthyroidism, the metabolism is so rapid that actually their growth plates never actually close. So for their entire life, they continue to get taller. There was a tremendous amount, again, you're probably all too young to remember this, but in ancient times, there was a mystical, magical basketball player by the name of Yao Ming that came over from China to play in the National Basketball Association. And China, again, it was this huge big thing. They had to purchase his contract and all that, and they were very secretive about his medical history and everything like that. And so there was a tremendous amount of speculation that he might have been an individual who suffered from hyperthyroidism and then had surgery likely to have his thyroid removed, which is why he stopped continuing to grow. But again, that was never proven because his medical records were, again, even to this day, never released from that. But so again, for those of you who may remember that, he was an example of someone who a lot of people thought had very stereotypical symptoms of hyperthyroidism, and so could potentially have been suffering from that for some time. All right, so that is that. Let's get to the easy question. How is the thyroid hormones T3 and T4 regulated?
Is it humorally through the, oh, I forget from where.
No problem.
The thyroid stimulating hormone by anterior part of the pituitary gland.
There you go, thyroid stimulated hormone. So which of our three regulatory processes would that be?
Humoral.
Humoral?
Hormonal.
Hormonal, right? It's the hormone itself that is stimulated. It's not like it's counting how many of the hormones are there. It is actually being stimulated by the hormone to produce more of them. All right, excellent. Questions on that?
Professor, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Sometimes people who have problem with their thyroid, they say they either lose too much weight or gain weight. Does it really have anything to do with these hormones?
Great question. So as I mentioned, with hyperthyroidism, there is a general overall increase in metabolism. So people who have hyperthyroidism can have a difficult time maintaining weight because their body's metabolism is so fast that it's constantly using energy. And so yes, putting on weight can be a problem for people who have hyperthyroidism.
And the other way around too. It's like harder to lose
Yes,
weight.
it can be, yes.
Hypo.
If you have hypothyroidism, you're correct. With hypothyroidism, it is harder to lose weight. There are some chronic illnesses involving the thyroid. There are some autoimmune disorders. So there's not just one causality to problems with the thyroid gland. But yes, there are some chronic illnesses that can affect the thyroid gland and its production. Or now that we know it's regulated by thyroid stimulating hormone in the anterior pituitary, if you think about it, if you have problems with your anterior pituitary, where your anterior pituitary isn't producing enough thyroid stimulating hormone, there may be nothing wrong with your thyroid gland, but without that thyroid stimulating hormone, you can't tell the thyroid gland to make T3 and T4. So the problem, again, doesn't even necessarily have to be with the thyroid gland. It could be a pituitary issue. All right. All righty, excellent. Now let's go back, wrong direction, to this picture. Notice as we talked about, there are these simple cuboidal cells that are forming these follicles. Here's a follicle, and here's a follicle, and here's a follicle. But notice there's also these cells in between. These cells in between tend to be a little larger. Their cytoplasm tends to be a little lighter in color. Here's one that's actually labeled. These cells are not a part of the follicle, but are next to, dare I say, even parallel alongside of the follicle. So how do you think we identify these cells that are next to the follicle, not actually a part of them?
Parafollicular cells.
These are indeed the parafollicular cells, absolutely. And these parafollicular cells are also glandular cells. They also produce a hormone, but they produce a completely different hormone. One you may be familiar with from 430. So again, our parafollicular cells produce a hormone called calcitonin. Anyone remember what calcitonin does? Let's see if we can figure out. Anybody remember the targets? Oops, what the targets, plural, of calcitonin are? Or what the overall effect of calcitonin is?
It regulates the calcium level in the blood.
Excellent. And was its job to bring calcium levels up or bring calcium levels down?
Down.
Excellent. So its overall effect is to reduce calcium levels in the blood. So there are three main targets it does to do this. The first of those targets is the osteoclasts. What do osteoclasts do again?
Break down bone matrix to release calcium in the blood.
Exactly. So the osteoclasts are the ones that chew up, break down the matrix, and release it into the blood, into the interstitial fluid. Absolutely, excellent. So would calcitonin want to increase their activity or decrease their activity?
Decrease.
Decrease. Right, so it inhibits osteoclasts. Anybody remember what the second target for calcitonin was?
Kidneys.
Kidneys, excellent. Kidneys, after all, are responsible for filtering stuff out of and reabsorbing things into our blood. Our kidneys produce 200 liters of filtrate during the course of the day, but do you produce 200 liters of urine?
No.
No, of course not. We'd all be sitting in the bathroom for this lecture if that was indeed the case. Absolutely not. The vast majority, 99% of that is reabsorbed. So by telling the kidney what to bring back and what not to bring back, it can play an important role in affecting calcium levels. So of course we tell the kidney, say, all that calcium that's in your filtrate, go ahead and leave that in there. Bring less back. So less calcium is reabsorbed. And so more leaves in the urine. So we can get rid of it that way. And how do we get calcium into our system to begin with?
By food, digestive.
Digestive system. So the other target of this is going to be the digestive system. We break down food and we absorb it. Now, if you also remember from 430, we talked about how you could drink a whole cow's worth of milk. But if you didn't have a particular hormone, you wouldn't be able to absorb that from the digestive system. And does anybody remember what that hormone was?
Was it calcitriol?
Exactly. Which, of course, if you remember, is the active form of what?
Vitamin D.
There you go. Excellent. So what calcitonin is also going to target is calcitriol production to reduce the amount of calcitriol that is produced. And we are going to decrease the amount of calcium that is absorbed from the digestive system. So notice by doing all of these things, we are going to accomplish our goal. And our goal, as we mentioned, was to reduce calcium levels in the blood. All right. So again, this plays an important role, produced by the parafollicular cells, reduces, and I would accept either of these answers. If I asked you what the effect of calcitonin is, you could either tell me all of the specific effects, or you could give me the overall effect. I would accept both of those answers. But here's a question. Does thyroid stimulating hormone regulate calcitonin levels as well? Let's think of it this way. When do you want to make more calcitonin?
When your calcium levels are too high.
When your calcium levels are too high. When do you want to make less calcitonin?
When your calcium levels are too low.
Right. So what do we need to pay attention with to know how much calcitonin to make? How are we regulating calcitonin levels?
Humoral.
Exactly. Humoral, which will get you partial credit. Humoral via, got the hard part. Give me the easy part.
Blood.
The hypothalamus.
No. What is it? Remember, humoral means you're counting something in the blood to see how much of it is there. What is it that we're counting in the blood to see how much of it is there?
Calcium.
Calcium, there you go. So it's regulated humorally via calcium. All right, questions on that? All right, I happen to see, I didn't catch who wrote it on the chat because it's moved up since then, but someone also mentioned another big thing with calcitonin is that basically it has the opposite effect of parathyroid hormone. So let's talk about, oh, and then of course we already talked about the follicular cells. Let's talk about parathyroid hormone. Here we see the nice illustration from your textbook, which also does a good job of showing us those parathyroid glands located there on the posterior side of the thyroid. And basically, calcitonin and parathyroid hormone are antagonistic hormones. So what do you think the three targets of the parathyroid hormone are?
Same as for calcitonin.
Yeah. The osteoclasts, the kidneys, and the digestive system via calcitriol. And if it is antagonistic, what is it going to do to the osteoclasts?
Increase the activity.
Yeah. Excite or increase activity. Excellent. What's it going to do to tell the kidneys to do?
Reabsorb less.
Less?
Or more.
Yeah. Let less calcium leave, right? So that means we need to reabsorb more calcium. And how much, what do we want to do to calcitriol? What do we want to do to the digestive system?
Increase calcitriol level.
Exactly, increase and get more calcium, or let's say it this way, out of the digestive system. Excellent. So what is the overall effect of parathyroid hormone?
Increase calcium in the blood.
Excellent. And how do you think it's regulated?
The same way that the thyroid hormone is.
And is that what you're going to write on the exam? The same way as the as calcitriol?
No, sorry. So humoral via calcium.
You were absolutely 100% correct, but yeah, absolutely. Humorally via calcium. But yes, absolutely, you're 100% correct. Nope, and I can't spell humoral. Excellent. Now, we have identified all the fun information about the parathyroid hormone, so we've done all of that. But now let's actually look at this gland. Notice here we have those telltale follicles that you find one place and one place only, and that is our thyroid gland. So we see some of those follicles here of our thyroid gland over here to the side. And then notice there's this big connective tissue septum separating these two glands from each other. And here we have a bunch of densely packed cells, but are these densely packed cells arranged in follicles the same way this one is?
No.
No.
No. So one of the first things that you're going to want to do on the exam is you're going to want to look for context cues, right? Notice if I just showed you this by itself at this magnification, is there anything about it that really makes it stand out that says, hey, this is the parathyroid gland?
Not really.
Not really, not really to me. When we look closer, we will see something that will help us to recognize it. But at this magnification, it isn't obvious. However, is this over here obvious?
Yes.
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 And if this is right next to that, does that suddenly make this obvious?
Yes.
Yeah. Remember, it's kind of like we talked about with the tonsils. Those lymphatic follicles by themselves don't really look any different from any others. But when we see that non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue, that tells us that that's in the mouth or that's in the throat, and we see those big tonsillar crypts. Those are the things that are the dead giveaways of what it is. So often we need to use context cues to tell where it is. And sitting right next to the thyroid gland is a huge context clue. However, we don't just have to rely on that. Notice if we increase the magnification, we see that now suddenly this tissue has two very distinct types of cells. There are these very small granular cells with dark stained cytoplasm, right? There's 4 of them there. I just circled them all together, but I was trying to emphasize the point. And then there are these cells here next to it that are kind of clear looking. They kind of almost look a little bit like adipose, but they're clearly not, because look, lo and behold, here's an adipocyte. I have 2 adipocytes right here and right here. But these cells that I'm surrounding are these big, huge, larger, clearer cells. Now, the darker stained cells, what do you think they're called?
Chief cells.
Chief cells. And what do you think the chief cells do? Well, what did we just finish talking about? What gland are we in?
Parathyroid.
So what do you think the chief cells do?
Are they the ones that secrete the parathyroid hormone?
Yeah, they're the ones that make and release the parathyroid hormone. These second cells, the clearer cells, the larger cells, are what are known as oxyphils. One of the interesting things about this is, notice this is a relatively young person's parathyroid gland, and this is a much older person's parathyroid gland. Notice in this older person, a vast majority of the cells now are these oxyphils. Notice we still have some of these other cells, the chief cells over here as well, but we've had this massive increase. Again, we're not talking about the adipocytes, that's something different. I'm talking about all of these things, the oxyphils. There is a dramatic increase in the number of oxyphils in our parathyroid gland as we age. Why?
Because do we produce less hormone as we get older?
Not necessarily.
What do the oxyphil cells do?
That's what I'm asking you. What do the oxyphils do? Why do we get more of them as we age? No, I mean, I'm really asking because nobody knows. So I'm hoping maybe you do. Yeah, nobody knows what these oxyphils do. Nobody knows why they increase in number as we age. They just know that this is something that occurs. And because these are here, it does make it a little easier to identify the parathyroid gland when we look at it up close. Notice at that lower magnification view, we couldn't see it, but we had the context clues of the thyroid gland to help us. These oxyphil and chief cells, these dramatically different cells here in our parathyroid gland help us to distinguish the two. But like I said, yeah, nobody knows what these oxyphils do. It's not fully understood or why they increase in age. Now, there is one thing that I want to warn you about. Remember, as we've talked about, there are these charts, and charts overall are pretty decent. They have some good information on them, but remember, they're also often made by artists. And artists aren't always the best scientists. Here on our chart from the endocrine system, we see a classic example of this. This is supposed to be the parathyroid gland. Notice one of the things we saw and the other one that was easy to see is there are these, let's not use black, adipose cells. That's something that's quite commonly found in our parathyroid gland. Notice we have the smaller chief cells and we have the bigger oxyphils. But what's the problem with this picture?
Oxyphils aren't clear.
Yeah, the oxyphils they've actually made darker. The coloring should be the other way around. The chief cells should be darker in color and the oxyphils should be lighter in color. So that is one of those, again, we won't say they got it wrong, but a little bit of artistic license that was taken here on this particular illustration. So if you're looking in the classroom at Open Lab on Friday, looking at these things, don't be fooled by this picture. It's a good picture. It's a decent picture of the parathyroid gland. They just got the coloring off of it.
What are the other cells, like the longer white ones with the orange things inside?
Blood vessels. These are blood vessels because after all, if you're going to produce a hormone and release it into the blood, you need blood vessels. So those are blood vessels with red blood cells in them. So that's what our artist is trying to represent there. See, they even put some smooth muscle around it to show us that it's a blood vessel, an artery, I guess, because it's more distinct, smooth muscle. While we're looking at this, see, there you go. See, there's the labels. And again, they got the color wrong. Notice what gland is this?
Thyroid.
Yeah. Notice again, what our artist has done very nicely is they've done a very good job of showing us the follicular cells, that simple cuboidal epithelial tissue that's forming that follicle. But notice here, in this case, the parafollicular cells, they've kind of colored them, made them look almost like kind of smooth muscle looking. They're kind of elongated and striated, spindle shaped. So again, clearly these cells are different. Oh, another blood vessel. These cells are different from the follicular cells. So they've at least done a good job of showing that for us. But they did make it look a little smooth muscle-like, which was not necessary. But clearly this is a different cell from this. So we shouldn't be confused by that on the exam.
Professor?
Yes.
In the thyroid, the cavities are those like large spaces outside of the follicle, right?
No, the cavity is the space of the follicle that contains the colloid.
Got it.
Yeah, cavity is a space, but it's not a hollow space. It's filled with a solution that contains a massive amount of that iodinized thyroid hormones, which we call the colloid. So the same way the cup holds the vodka, right? The follicle, the cavity holds the colloid.
Thank you.
And I meant coffee, not vodka. It's coffee in the morning. All right. Other questions on that? All right. Excellent. That brings us to our pancreas. Remember, our pancreas is that kind of feather-shaped gland located inferior to the stomach. It wraps around, or I should say the duodenum, the beginning part of the small intestine, wraps around the head of it. And our pancreas is our largest mixed gland. What do I mean by a mixed gland?
Does it release more than one hormone?
True, but if you think about it, the thyroid gland just released more than one hormone. Although you're right, it is smaller than the pancreas. But nope, that's not quite what I mean.
Is it both exocrine and endocrine?
There you go. It has both an endocrine and an exocrine function. And we see that in the histology of it. The vast majority of this gland are these dark stained circular alveoli that are actually called the pancreatic alveoli. And these pancreatic alveoli are what are responsible for producing the vast majority of the digestive enzymes that are used to fully break down our food in the small intestine. They produce pancreatic amylase, which breaks down our carbohydrates, pancreatic lipase, which breaks down our lipids, right? Trypsin, which breaks down proteins, deoxyribonuclease, which breaks down DNA, ribonuclease, which breaks down RNA, right? There are a massive number of digestive enzymes. It produces a massive amount of bicarbonate. Anybody know what bicarbonate is?
Is it carbon with two monocarbon? Oh, I forgot.
No. So bicarbonate is a buffer. It's a basic molecule, exactly. It is a buffer that helps to neutralize the acidity of the food as it leaves the stomach. Remember, as we talked about, the pH of the stomach is 1 to 2, right? So we need to neutralize that acidity so that the small intestine can process that food. This is an exocrine function. Remember, it is releasing it into the small intestine. And remember, the lumen of our small intestine is outside of the body. So all of these pancreatic acini are exocrine glands that connect to ducts and carry the substance out of the body. However, notice there are these two little islands in the stream, because that is what we are. And as you can see, these two structures here are the pancreatic islets. These are the islets of Langerhans. And of course, why are they called the islets of Langerhans?
Langerhans found them.
Good old Bob Langerhans was the first one who identified it and planted its flag in it. And these islets are what provide the endocrine function. Inside this islets are actually 4 distinct types of cells that actually produce 4 distinct hormones. However, are you responsible for all 4 of those hormones?
No,
No.
Only
how
2.
how many are you responsible for?
2.
Just 2, exactly. Excellent. So again, we have 4 in reality, but 2 amino acid based hormones that you are responsible for. The first one is one we've already talked about. Alpha, beta, delta, gamma. Those are the 4 cells found in the pancreatic islets that produce the 4 hormones. And it is the beta cells that produce our insulin. I think we kind of already did this one on our chart, but now we're more comfortable and confident with the information. So what are our targets of insulin?
Glucose?
Well, it has to do with glucose. The effect has to do, but remember, in the case of targets, we're talking about cells or organs. What is influenced by insulin? Which cells of the body?
Most cells.
Yeah, absolutely. Most cells are indeed influenced by insulin. But if you remember, as we talked about, there are 2 cells or types of cells in particular that are really, really sensitive to insulin levels, really 3. But if you give me 2, I'll be happy with that. Excellent. There we go. Adipose, skeletal muscle. Anyone know what the third is?
Liver.
Yeah. These are big targets. Now, you are right in when it comes to adipose, liver, and skeletal muscle. Absolutely. What does it tell these cells to do in relation to glucose?
Get it out of the blood and store it.
Exactly, absolutely. So its job is tells these cells to draw glucose out of the blood and store it. As we talked about, the liver and skeletal muscle stores it in the form of glycogen. As we mentioned, adipose converts it into triglycerides. But they're storing it. And again, the net effect of that is that it lowers glucose levels in the blood. So guess how it's regulated?
Humoral via glucose.
Excellent. The second hormone you're responsible for coming from the pancreatic islet is glucagon. It is produced by the alpha cells. Not as many people are familiar with this one, but based on the name, what do you think it's going to influence when it comes to its effect? What do you think its effect is going to be? It's going to, again, have something to do with glucose. So of those three things we just talked about, it turns out the primary target of glucagon is the liver. Remember, as we've talked about, the blood from your digestive system processing that food goes to the liver first, so it can become nutrient appropriate before it is distributed throughout the body. And even though we're all taking school from home now, working from home now, right? Having DoorDash and everybody else bring us our food and everything along those lines, even though we never leave the house anymore, we are not constantly eating, right? Despite what our wives say. And so as a result of that, your glucose levels can fluctuate during the time of day. So if glucose levels drop, glucagon tells the liver to start breaking down some of that glycogen and releasing it into the blood. So its goal is going to be to basically break down that glucose, that glycogen into glucose, and basically increase glucose levels in the blood. This is a very important hormone for individuals when they're fasting, for instance. For Ramadan or other religious or cultural or societal reasons, when people are fasting, glucagon becomes an important hormone that helps to maintain glucose levels in the blood for those individuals. And guess how glucagon is regulated as well?
Humorally via glucose.
Yeah. Notice again, here we have two other hormones that are close together in location, or in this case, they're right next door to each other, that once again have that antagonistic control, right, or interaction. These type of antagonistic interactions allow us to keep precise control of these things. Is it important to maintain pretty precise control of glucose levels in our blood? Do we want those just fluctuating wildly? No. And calcium, we didn't talk about it before, but calcium is even more so. Again, this is not a number you need to know or a range you need to know. But in your blood, the normal range of calcium level in your blood is basically somewhere between 8.5 and 11 milligrams per deciliter. Now, like I said, you don't need to memorize that unless you want to. As I've talked about many times, this type of information is perfect for wooing women in a bar. Just walk up to a woman at a bar, look her straight in the eye and say, hey, did you know your calcium levels in your blood are between 8.5 and 11 milligrams per deciliter? And they just swoon when you say those things to them. But again, you don't have to memorize that. But the point I'm trying to show you is how tight of a regulation that is. And so by having these types of antagonistic controls, we can maintain that precision. It's not any different than the temperature in your house. Nowadays, with smart thermostats, you can set a range of temperatures you want your house to be at. And if it goes too high, the AC comes on and brings it down. If it goes too low, the heater comes on and brings it up, right? For the past couple months, you've been using nothing but the AC, but yesterday morning, our house got down to like 64 degrees because we left the windows open all night long. Right, so having those two antagonistic controls can help to give us that precision. Uncontrolled diabetes mellitus, which is a common condition where you get the high levels of glucose. There are several concerns. One is damage to the kidney, because the kidney is having to overprocess that fluid. It can also lead to dehydration, because as that excess glucose is leaving the kidneys, the water is going to follow all that glucose off, and dehydration can be an effect of that. The other concern with it is by changing the osmolarity of the blood, it can lead to an increase in viscosity in the blood that can be more likely to damage red blood cells. Can also lead to, and then when that happens, you can get congestion in capillaries. So one of the things that you hear about that occur with people who have uncontrolled diabetes is it is a disorder of the blood vessels. So for instance, at the fingers or in the feet, that damage to the blood vessels can decrease blood flow, which decreases oxygen levels. So they can start to get sores on their feet or on their hands that aren't able to heal, damage to the retina, so it can affect vision. So there are many complications that can occur from having chronic high glucose levels. Yep. All righty. Questions on that? All right, excellent. How are we on time? Excellent. All right. Oh, last thing, notice this particular stain. What's great about this particular section, this is a section that was taken, a very nice section of a pancreatic islet. 3 different stains were actually used on this one single slide. And the advantage of that is here in our pancreatic islet, again, the islet is the easy part to see. We can clearly see that pancreatic islet. We can clearly distinguish it from all these ball-shaped, dark-stained pancreatic acini, pancreatic acini that are sitting next to it. And what's cool about this is you can actually see the 4 different distinct types of cells to be able to distinguish the alpha, the beta, the gamma, and the delta. But as I mentioned, this required 3 different stains, 2 of which are very, very expensive. And so if we were in the classroom, would you necessarily get to see a slide that looked like this?
Probably not.
No, your slide might look something a little more like this. Again, we can clearly distinguish between the acini and the pancreatic islet that we see here. One of the things that I personally love about this particular picture is it has this. Anybody know what the heck this is right here?
Blood vessel? I don't know.
Not a bad guess. I wouldn't get excited about blood vessel. What would I get excited about? It's a nerve. Those are myelinated axons. It is a cross section through a nerve. Neuroscientist, I get excited about brain stuff. All right, the point is, notice with this particular stain, you can't distinguish the alpha, the beta, the gamma, and the delta. So I'm not going to hold you to that on the exam. On the exam, I'm not going to point an arrow right here and say, what type of cell is this and what hormone does this cell produce? Instead, I would ask you, what hormone is produced by an alpha cell in this region, or what cell is produced by a beta cell in this region? So I would specifically say alpha or beta cell, as opposed to just pointing at one and asking you to be able to tell what it is. Now, is it possible to know what that one is? Yeah, absolutely. But do I expect you to be able to do it? No. So I won't hold you histologically for identifying alpha and beta cells, but you absolutely positively need to know what they do. Which one produces which hormone, what the target of that hormone is and what the effect of that hormone is. And the good news is they're regulated the same way. So that part's easy. All right. Questions on that? All right, excellent. Now the fun begins. From here, we move to the adrenal gland. There is a whole lot going on here in this adrenal gland. So this is the perfect opportunity to take our first break. Let's go ahead and take our first break here. We will restart at 1:20, and I will start the recording at that time. All righty. Any questions before we take our first break? All right, I'll see you in 15 minutes then. Okay. Our goal now is to talk about the adrenal gland. What I like about this particular picture here is it does a nice job of showing the anatomy of the adrenal gland. Like many structures we've seen in the body, it has a chewy nougat center. And that chewy nougat center we can see here. And what do we call that innermost region?
The medulla.
Medulla, excellent. And then notice also we can see 3 distinct regions to the cortex. We can see, well, I guess a 4th structure as well. We can see the fibrous outer layer as well. It has a fibrous outer layer, but obviously that's just, as the name indicates, fibrous outer layer. But what we can see is there are 3 distinct regions or 3 distinct zones to the cortex of the adrenal gland. And each of these 3 distinct zones have their own organization to the glandular tissue. I guess I should say that. I think we mentioned that already, but I'll remind you here. The cortex is glandular tissue. It's glandular tissue. And remember, this is also where we produce our lipid-based hormones. And we have 3 distinct zones that produce 3 distinct classes of hormones that with their own 3 distinct regulatory processes. The medulla, on the other hand, is nervous tissue. And as we mentioned, this is the one that releases 1 class of hormones with obviously 1 regulatory process. And we already mentioned this. This is nervous tissue. How is the medulla regulated? Nervous tissue. So how do you think it's regulated?
Neurally.
Yeah. Via?
Hypothalamus.
Close. Okay, let's think about this. What is the primary hormone, the primary specific hormone that is released by the medulla of the adrenal gland?
Oh, epinephrine.
Yeah, adrenaline, epinephrine. So how is it regulated neurally via what?
The sympathetic nervous system.
There we go. Excellent. So we have these nice distinct areas. This view, we can't really tell the organization of the tissue easily over here in the cortex, but we can clearly see that there is, while we may not be able to see the specifics of it, we can clearly see that there are 3 distinct regions that are different in their color and different in their organization as we look at that. And of course, if we increase the magnification, we can see that as well. Now, as I mentioned, one of the keys to organizing yourself, because I'm going to cheat here for a second, go to the whiteboard. again, here is the kidney. Here is the adrenal gland sitting on top of it. And of course, those are not drawn to scale. As we talked about, the medulla is deep and the cortex is superficial. So when identifying these regions, too often, the illustrations and stuff that you'll see from the textbook start up at the top of the page and go down to the bottom of the page. That is not always the case. So the key characteristic when you see the adrenal gland that you're going to want to do to help you to distinguish and identify where you're at is the first thing you're going to do is look for that fibrous capsule, that outer surface, that fibrous capsule. And when you find that fibrous capsule, then it doesn't matter which way the slide is oriented, you will be able to figure out the regions from there. So notice if we go back to this pretty picture from your textbook, the first thing we are going to find is that fibrous capsule, which is up here. And once we find this fibrous capsule, then we can easily distinguish the three distinct regions. We have this area with more of ball shape, globular shaped secretory structures. We have our second region where it is more linear shaped secretory regions. Oh, I took that one a little too far. We have our third region, which is more of a mesh-like region. Net looking in its appearance. And then, of course, we have the deepest area, and that deepest area is the medulla. Different tissue, different cells, different function. So 4 distinct regions. And as long as we find this fibrous capsule, we can identify those. I make a point of emphasizing this because if we go back to that chart we were looking at before, notice here is their adrenal gland. And this is something, again, if you're in the classroom looking at this chart, which I strongly encourage you to do, one of the things that people get confused by is the orientation. Again, here we have that kind of triangular-ish shape to our adrenal gland with the medulla in the center of it here. However, if you look closely at this, what you will notice is that they have put a little rectangle down here at the bottom. This rectangle is what they have blown up for us. And notice it's from the inferior side of the adrenal gland. So here we see 4 distinct regions. So the number one thing we're going to want to look for is that fibrous capsule. And when we find this fibrous capsule, that is going to allow us to see all the rest of the adrenal gland. Notice it starts with these ball-shaped structures. This is the zona glomerulosa, glom, ball-shaped structure that we see here. That leads into the linear portion, kind of like the way that our muscle cells line up in the fascicles. And lo and behold, this is the zona fasciculata. And then our third region is this kind of mesh interconnected net appearing. And as we know, a mesh net structure is reticular. So this is the zona reticularis. So notice it is the orientation of the glandular cells that allow us to distinguish these 3 regions. Glomerulosa is always superficial, closest to the fibrous capsule, then fasciculata, then reticularis, which then is closest to the medulla. So notice this one goes superficial to deep in this direction. Whereas the illustration in your textbook goes the exact opposite direction, superficial to deep. So it doesn't matter whether it's left to right, top to bottom, right to left, bottom to top. The key to orienting yourself in the adrenal gland is to find the fibrous capsule. And once you find the fibrous capsule, you can do everything else. The fibrous capsule leads to the zona glomerulosa, the ball-shaped secretory structures. Deep to that is the zona fasciculata with the linear parallel, like fascicles of a muscle region, which leads to the deepest region of the cortex, the zona reticularis, which has this kind of mesh net-like appearance to it, ultimately leading to the medulla underneath. All right. Questions about these 4 distinct regions to the adrenal gland? If we're comfortable with the histology, then we can get to all the other things we need to know. All right, stunned silence means we understand, Dr. Slutsky, go faster. So excellent, that is what I love to hear. So as we have talked about, the cortex here is the first location that we're going to talk about where we produce our lipid base or our steroid hormones. And not surprisingly, all of them collectively in the entire cortex are known as corticosteroids because they're steroids produced in the cortex. That makes it convenient. But remember, as I also mentioned, each of this has their own distinct class of hormones they produce. The zona glomerulosa produces a class of hormones called mineralocorticoids. Corticoid, of course, refers to the fact that it is a, lipid based made in the cortex. What do you think mineralo refers to?
Minerals.
Minerals. So this plays a very important role in helping us to maintain the electrolyte balances of our humors of our body. The zona fasciculata produces glucocorticoids, corticoid, steroid of the cortex. Gluco refers to
Glucose.
Glucose. This is going to help us to mobilize our resources like glucose during a stress response. And the third class are gonadocorticoids. Again, corticosteroids that involve what?
The gonads. So like
Gonads.
estrogen and.
Yeah. So see how easy that is? The name of these classes tell you exactly what they do. Excellent. All right, questions on that? Now, again, as I mentioned, these are classes of hormones. Each of these classes has at least a half dozen, if not more, different hormones that it makes. But remember, for each of these, we said you will be responsible for at least one, typically the most common that is produced in this area. So let's look at each of these areas. Now, the one last thing I want to say. So any questions on this before we move on? Okay, excellent. Notice in all the pictures we have looked at so far, like this one here, as I mentioned, when you find that fibrous capsule, that allows you to orient yourself in this tissue. So when I show you the cortex of the adrenal gland, it will always be in this context. I will always show you all 3 layers, and in my arrow or my bracket will say, all right, what is the name of this region? What is the class of hormones produced in this region? What is the specific hormone produced in this region? Right? What is the function of that hormone, target of that hormone? How is it regulated? All of those things in a picture like this. I mention that because as we go through the lecture here, for instance, here, we look at the zona glomerulosa. The nice thing about looking at this right now, as you and I are sitting here looking at it, is we can clearly see the ball-shaped structures. So since you know we're talking about the zona glomerulosa, it gives us some context. But if I just gave you this slide by itself, would I expect you to be able to recognize this clearly as being the zona glomerulosa? No, of course not. Again, as I've said many times, what I like about this class is class is hard. And because it's hard, I don't have to be tricky. I wouldn't do something as tricky as this. I'm showing it to you up close here so we can see those ball-shaped secretory structures. But the adrenal cortex, I will always show the entire cortex so that you can orient yourself and coordinate the information that way. All right, is that clear?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So as I mentioned, zona glomerulosa produces mineralocorticoids. And the target of the mineralocorticoids, as we mentioned, are mineralocorticoids help us to regulate our electrolyte balance. So not surprisingly, where do we do most of that regulation? In the kidney. Again, the kidney is going to help us to hold on to or release ions. So if we have too much sodium, we can get rid of it. If we don't have enough, we can bring more back. If we don't have enough potassium, we can bring it back. But if we have too much, we can get rid of it. It plays a very important role in regulating our electrolyte balance. And so not surprisingly, we have dozens of electrolytes. We have dozens of mineralocorticoids. But by far, the most common mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. And I think we've talked about aldosterone once before, briefly, but we did talk about it. Does anybody remember which particular electrolyte aldosterone helps us to regulate? Well, let's think of it this way. If it is the most common hormone, it probably helps us to regulate the most common electrolyte. And what's the most common electrolyte in our body?
Sodium.
There you go. So mineralocorticoids allow us to regulate all of our electrolytes in general, but specifically aldosterone helps us to regulate sodium levels. And based on that, how do you think it's regulated?
Humorally.
Yeah. So obviously for mineralocorticoids, it would be hormonally via electrolytes. And of course, for aldosterone, it would be humorally via electrolytes, and aldosterone specifically humorally via sodium levels. All right. Excellent. Questions on that? Perfect. All right, let's switch to the zona fasciculata. Again, I'm showing this to you here just for informational sake. This is not how I would ask it on the exam, but we know that and we can see these long linear fascicle-like glandular structures within this region. And what was the class of hormones I said we produced in the zona fasciculata?
Glucocorticoids?
Glucocorticoids, absolutely. Now, remember, we talked about glucocorticoids, we talked about glucose levels with insulin and glycogen. Those help us to maintain normal glucose levels. Our glucocorticoids are really about mobilizing our resources when dealing with a stress response. When that bear with an axe walks in the room, right? I don't necessarily need to be able to release all this insulin to get all the glucose out of my blood. Instead, I want the opposite to be true, because I know I'm either going to have to fight that bear with an axe, or I'm going to have to outrun somebody who's in the room with me. And that is going to require resources. So these glucocorticoids, they're basically going to help with our immune response, that stress response. Mobilizing that resources, dealing with stress. Its targets then are going to be liver and adipose. These two are going to be releasing that fuel into the blood so that we can, or I guess I should say fuel in the blood. Oops. Into the blood so that we are able to deal with that stress response. But notice there's another interesting target here as well, the immune cells, right? And notice, as we just mentioned, we want to get that glycogen into the blood, metabolize that fat, get our energy resources ready. But notice these also suppress our immune response. Why? Why might we want to suppress our immune response when that bear with an axe walks in the room?
So we can focus our energy on fight or flight at that
Okay,
point.
I like that. Both of you guys had similar ideas with that. Absolutely. Where again, obviously, our immune response requires energy, and we don't want to necessarily waste time with that. And that's probably a good idea as well. But why else? Why else might it be convenient to suppress our immune response, especially our anti-inflammatory response? Well, let's think of it this way. If I choose the flight choice, and as I'm running away from that bear, I happen to trip and sprain my ankle, is it going to help me to get away from that bear if my ankle swells up like a cantaloupe?
No.
No. So by suppressing my immune response, by suppressing that inflammation, I'm going to be able to run farther longer. May I be doing long-term damage to my ankle because I'm using it when it's injured? Sure, but not as much as that bear with an axe is going to do to me. So notice, by suppressing our immune response, again, it is helping us to deal with that life or death situation. This is a hugely important process when dealing with bears with axes. But here's the problem. How many of you have been stressed by a bear with an axe in the past week? Or the past month? Or the past year? Anyone? For me, it's been twice in the past year, and that's it. Hardly ever, right? Does that mean I haven't been stressed at all for the past year?
No.
No, we're pretty much all living in a constant state of stress, right? Even if you're not talking about the government shutdown or the COVID virus or any of those types of things, you've got that 10-page paper due on Tuesday. You've got a presentation due on Tuesday. You've got an exam on Thursday, right? And here's the problem with the things that stress us now. The things that stress us now cause this same type of biological response. The difference is, if I'm being stressed by a 10-page paper that's due on Friday, how do I resolve that stress? I sit here on my computer and I type. Notice now, exactly, you do the paper. Notice now, the things that stress us out don't require the same type of physical response that they did before. So we're building up all this energy, all this fuel into our blood to deal with the stress physically. And when we don't do any physical activity, what happens to all that glucose that's been released into the blood?
Is it being stored in adipose?
Being stored in fat, absolutely. I was glorious before I had kids, right? I had hair, my skin looked nice, I was thin, right? Kids are the worst thing that can ever happen to a person, right? This is what happens when you have kids, right? So if you haven't had them already, right, don't. If you have them now, get rid of them. Otherwise, this is what will happen to you, right? So dealing with that stress now has that same physiological response. It triggers the same release of these hormones. And again, half a dozen different glucocorticoids, but as we've already mentioned, the most common one is cortisol, or what is also known as hydrocortisone, right? You may have heard of those before, not in the sense of the hormones that you produce, but if you have a swollen elbow from playing too much tennis, or you have a rash on your arm, what may you put on those areas to decrease the inflammation?
Hydrocortisone.
Yeah, hydrocortisone, absolutely. Right? Or think of the other effect of this, right? It suppresses your immune response. So you spend a week stressing about that presentation you have to give at work, stressing about that exam, and then either the day before the exam, if you're really unlucky, or if you're lucky, the day after the exam, what typically happens to you right at the time of the exam or the day after the exam? You get sick, right? How many people come into the test with a runny nose? Or as soon as that paperwork is done, you turn in that exam, the very next day, you've got a cold. Why? Because you've been suppressing your immune response with all that stress. And so that's allowed viruses that normally you'd be able to easily beat off to be able to get in and cause problems. So as soon as that stress is gone, then you spend the next week sick. Right? Many of these are things that we've all dealt with. We may not have understood it, but now we at least know why. Questions on this?
Is there any like cortisol like supplement that you could take during high stress times to like make it better, or it's not much you could do?
Do you mean to like cancel out the cortisol?
Oh yeah, it's the opposite way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you
so
wanna-
to cancel it. Sorry.
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. Obviously, again, this is driven by stress. So I guess doing activities that reduce stress or being physical when stressed. So yes, you may be working on a studying for an exam, but maybe read your book while you're on the treadmill or something like that. I mean, there might be ways to combat the effect of it by doing things along those lines.
I just got confused with the way I was more thinking if you could take it, but then realized it was opposite of that.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily want to take it. If you're stressed, you're releasing this already. That's not the issue. However, what is the issue is how is it regulated?
Would it be neural via stimuli or something?
Not a bad guess. Obviously, when we think of stress, we do think of that response. But remember, the stress in the neural is going to the medulla. This is glandular tissue. So we're not really going to be as efficient at affecting it that way. So we can click off that one, right? If you're stressed, are you necessarily looking for how much glucose is in the blood, or how much, is there some kind of stress chemical that's in the blood that we're looking for, counting the numbers of something that would help us with that? No. So what does that leave us with?
Hormonal.
Hormonal?
Hormonally. If only there was a hormone we learned about that was capable of affecting the function of the cortex of the adrenal gland.
The adrenocorticotropic hormone.
There you go. Remember, we said our adrenocorticotropic hormone targeted the adrenal cortex, affected glucocorticoid levels. So there you go. So our anterior pituitary releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, which you can, after you've written it out once, you can abbreviate ACTH to regulate the activity of this region. All right. Questions on that? All right, here's where things get a little interesting. Here is our zona reticularis. Again, we can see it's not parallel in its organization. We have these different bundles of cells going in different orientation, giving a net-like or mesh-like structure to it. So we have that mesh or net reticular region, the deepest region. And it produces gonadocorticoids, which clearly have something to do with the gonads. And in fact, what it produces are two main classes of hormones, androgens. And of course, what is the most common type of androgen?
Estrogen.
No, what's the most common androgen?
Testosterone.
Testosterone. Testosterone and estrogens. Anyone know the most common estrogen?
Is it estradiol?
Yep, estradiol. Whoops. Estradiol, absolutely. Now, here's something interesting. Is this the most common place where we make these hormones? It's not a trick question.
No.
No. Where do we primarily, or let's say it this way, not the primary location where we produce these hormones. Where are these hormones normally produced?
The reproductive.
Yeah. Mostly these are produced in the gonads, in the ovaries for women and the testes for males. That makes these a little bit interesting. There's only a small amount of them that are produced here in the adrenal gland. And let's think about this. If my adrenal gland produces a testosterone, or my gonad produces a testosterone, when this testosterone gets to my muscle cell, is it going to affect the muscle cell differently, whether it was made by the gonads or whether it was made by the adrenal gland? No. The muscle cell doesn't care where it was made. Its functions are going to be the same. So notice the targets and functions of these are essentially the same. As for the ones that are made by the gonads. So why are they made here? Well, and an answer that I've given you guys before, we don't fully know. We don't quite understand why these are made here. Their targets and their effects are going to be similar to the ones that are produced by the androgens and the estrogens from the gonads, which is the primary location. So why have this extra place to produce it? Well, what they believe is most likely is that it plays a bigger role in helping to emphasize our secondary sexual characteristics. What do we mean by that?
Secondary traits of gender, such as areas where hair grows.
Exactly. You absolutely have the right idea. These are the kind of biological characteristics, as you mentioned, that are basically brought on by puberty, right? Basically how we tell a boy from a man, a girl from a woman, right? Secondary hairs growing on the cheeks, buccal region, mental region, thoracic region, anogenital region, stuff like that. Widening of the hips, enlargement of the mons pubis for females, thickening of the muscles and the shoulders, cartilage for males, right? Those secondary sexual characteristics, they may be enhanced by these hormones that are produced here. And again, the other thing that it may play a role, especially in females, is playing a role in the aggression and the libido. One of the things that have been closely studied when looking at hormones are rhesus macaque monkeys. Rhesus macaque monkeys have a very rigid hierarchy to their social structure. They have a very elaborate social hierarchy. They live in clans, they work together, very high social animals, and they have a very rigid social structure. And what they've done, they've got the alpha male and the beta male and the gamma and the zeta and all of those. And what they found is that by taking the blood samples from these monkeys, the alpha male has the highest amount of androgens in their blood. The one that has the second is the beta male, and so on and so forth. And they've actually gone in with like the fifth or sixth monkey, injected them with androgens to elevate their androgen levels, and guess what happens?
They become alpha.
Yeah, when you increase the androgens of that male above the others, they become the alpha, right? They did similar studies in a similar environment that has a very similar rigid hierarchy and a high social interaction, and that is on the stock exchange in Wall Street. The traders have a very social and very hierarchical level to them. And again, they drew blood samples from them and looked at them. And typically the more alpha males in that environment had higher levels of androgens. Now, I don't believe they injected any of the lesser ones to see if they became higher, but again, it's another example where we see these types of hormone levels play a role, not just in our sexual maturity, but also in our societal interactions. Things like aggression, as you guys mentioned, fighting, things like libido and sex drive. And so obviously females in particular produce a very small amount of androgens on their own in their gonads. So as a result, this androgens being produced in the adrenal gland may play a role in modifying that sex drive, modifying that aggression in females. But again, if you think about how hard it is to study these hormones to begin with, right? In a test tube, we can see whether a cell responds to a hormone, but because of all the potential actions and interactions with other hormones, it's very hard to see and precisely what these hormones are doing in their body. And when you have hormones that are produced in two different locations, is it going to be really easy to tell which ones from the gonads are affecting and which ones from the adrenal gland are affecting? No, it's going to be almost impossible. And so not surprisingly, notice we can't just measure the levels of these in someone's blood to see how they change because we don't know where they're coming from. So do we really understand how these are regulated? No. It is likely hormonal, but do we know it for certain? Do we know which hormones and how? No. So is this going to be a question I'm going to ask on the exam?
No.
No. So on the exam, I can guarantee you with 100% certainty, I will not ask you how the gonadocorticoids in the zona reticularis are regulated. So you can just put a big X through that portion of the cell. All right.
If you repeat the target, is it just the gonads?
So again, as we mentioned, the targets are going to be similar to the estrogens and the androgens. So yes, some of that will be the gonads for the maturation of the gametes. However, again, this is one that is much more likely going to be affected by these hormones that are produced in the gametes. So it is much more likely, so we can maybe put an asterisk by that. It's much more likely that it is going to be the hair, the muscles, the adipose, the skin, the bones, all of those things that we talked about that give us those secondary sexual characteristics. So those are going to be the targets. And like I said, we'll talk about androgens and estrogens in more detail and what they do when we get to the gonads. So basically, androgens and estrogens have the same effect regardless of where they're produced. So we'll wait till we get to the gonads to talk about it there. All right. Questions on that? All right, with that, we are done with the cortex, but we're not done with the adrenal gland. Again, there is nothing about this slide that makes it look anything like anything we would be able to easily recognize by itself. So again, the medulla will see deep to the cortex, deep from that fibrous capsule, and that's how we'll recognize it. But remember, this medulla is nervous tissue. In fact, if you think about it, what we learned in 430 is essentially it is a sympathetic ganglion containing those postganglionic neurons. And it produces a completely different class of hormones. Not only does it produce a different class of hormones, but these catecholamines, the class of hormones that it produced, are actually amino acid based. So unlike the cortex that produces lipid based, the medulla only produces amino acid based hormones. As I mentioned, catecholamine is a whole class of hormones, but by far the vast majority of it is epinephrine. And again, it is perfectly acceptable to also call this adrenaline. And norepinephrine, or perfectly acceptable to call it noradrenaline. Both of those names are perfectly acceptable. And luckily, because we talked about the sympathetic nervous system in 430, what are the targets of adrenaline and noradrenaline?
The heart muscle
And what does it do to the heart?
increases force of contraction and heart rate.
Excellent. What's another target? Liver. Excellent. What does it tell the liver to do? What does our liver release? We'll get to that in a second, Samuel. Hold on. Again, we want to release that energy. There you go. Blood vessels. Now you say blood vessels contract, and that is true. Most blood vessels contract, but do all blood vessels contract in response to adrenaline?
No.
No. Blood vessels to where?
To peripheral blood vessels.
Okay, again, most peripheral blood vessels, right? Maybe you have the right idea. Maybe it'll be easier to think of terms of where blood vessels dilate. Blood vessels dilate going to our muscles, skeletal muscle. Where else? Well, we just said liver. That's not a surprise.
The head.
The head, see, again, let's think about this. When you're stressed, when that bear walks into the room, how much thought do you really need to put in? When that bear with an axe walks in the room, is that the perfect opportunity to think what your long-term goals might be?
No, you just run.
Right, exactly. You only have very limited decisions to make. I know this seems very counterintuitive to a lot of people, because if I had a nickel for every student who told me I do my best work when I am stressed, when it's down to the 11th hour and I have that stress, that's when I do my best work. And that is such complete bullshit, right? Your brain does not need blood when you're in a stress situation, right? The decisions you make at that point of time are simple: run or fight. So the brain absolutely is not one of the areas that gets more blood. You do not think better when you're stressed, right? So you get the right idea. The lungs, the heart, the liver, skeletal muscle, these are the places where the blood dilates. They contract pretty much to everywhere else. So basically non-essential organs, digestive system, kidneys, places like that. And again, not that the kidneys and the digestive system aren't essential organs, they are, but they're not essential when we're dealing with that stress response, right? Now, we know our neural tissue is very sensitive to oxygen levels, so we don't want to decrease blood flow to the brain at this point, but we don't increase it either. So the blood flow to the brain doesn't change, but pretty much everywhere else in the body it does. And since most of them contract, as you mentioned, this will also increase blood pressure. Excellent. All right. Not only do we have more blood going to our lungs, but our airways dilate. Excellent. And again, this is one of the reasons why I carry an EpiPen around with me wherever I go with my daughter. As I've mentioned, she has an extreme peanut and tree nut allergy. And if she were to go into anaphylactic shock, basically two major issues occur. She has massive vasodilation of her blood vessels, where most of her blood vessels dilate, and her blood pressure drops dramatically, making it hard for her to get blood to her brain. And the mucous membrane of her airways thicken, making it harder for her to get air to her lungs. So I jab her with the pen, heart beats faster and stronger, blood vessels constrict, and the blood pressure goes up, making it easier for her to get blood to her brain. The smooth muscle of our airways dilate, hopingly compensating for the thickness of the mucous membrane so that she can get air into her lungs. All right. I can think of at least one more good one. What else dilates when you have that stress response?
The pupils.
Yeah. Right. Bears with axes are tricky. They use a lot of camouflage. It's easy for them to blend in with their environment. So you need to open up your eyes, letting more light in so you can better distinguish them from the foliage that surrounds them. So all of these things are major targets and major functions of that adrenaline, right? So, oops. Again, I listed some of them here and etc. All those things we talked about in 430. And essentially, as we talked about in 430, they're basically responsible for our short-term stress response. And we already said it, but remind me, how is it regulated?
Neural versus the via the sympathetic nervous system.
There you go. Perfect.
So would you accept short-term stress response as an effect? Or maybe a handful of what
Yeah,
we
I was going to say, it'd probably be best to split the difference. Like two. Give me at least two. Or like say short-term stress response, like increase in heart rate or strength or contraction. How about that? Give me at least two things off the list, or say short-term stress response and give me at least one example. How about something like that? We'll kind of split the difference because you don't have to give me all of these. But let's split the difference that way. If you're going to say short-term stress response, that's fine, but at least give me one example. If you're not going to say short-term stress response, then at least give me two examples.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. All right. Any other questions on this? All right. With this, we are done with the adrenal gland, but we're not done with our hormones yet, although this is another good stopping point. Again, I appreciate this is a lot of material and dense material. We are now on to the gonads, but again, let's go ahead and take a break first. We'll take another 15-minute break. So we will restart at, it'll be 2:28, 2:29, and I will start the recording at that time. All right. Any other questions before we take our first break? All right, our second break. All right, see you in 15 minutes. All righty. Let us move on to the ovary. Like the adrenal gland, we have an outer cortex and we have an inner medulla. However, in the ovary, these areas are more poorly defined. There isn't kind of as much of a distinct line with the ovary the same way we saw in the adrenal gland. However, we can easily distinguish the cortex of the ovary because the cortex of the ovary is where you're going to find all of these follicles. Now, when we get to the reproductive system in the end of this section, this class, we'll talk about all the different types of follicles and their different stages, and we'll get into this in a lot more detail. For simplicity, we are going to look at what is known as a Graafian or a mature follicle. So this is an example of a mature follicle. We can tell that this is a mature follicle by one primary key characteristic that is kind of a big dead giveaway. And that is this big, huge, fluid-filled space known as the antrum. The antrum is this big, huge, fluid-filled space where our egg is maturing. And of course, here is that egg. Of course, we're not going to get away with something as simple as a name like egg. We're going to use the appropriate term for it, which is, of course, an oocyte. For being able to identify that. And it is still an immature egg at this stage. As we'll learn, it doesn't actually mature unless it is fertilized. So here we have this immature oocyte, and it is surrounded by cells. Now, when we look at the surrounding cells, we can see that they kind of come in two flavors. We have our cells that are forming the walls of the follicle itself. So here we have this big, huge follicle that comes around. And notice some of those follicular cells actually wrap around the egg itself as it's maturing. So we have all of these cells that are the follicular cells. These are the cells of the follicle. They are actually known as granulosa cells. And they are the cells that are responsible for producing the estrogens. So estrogens are produced by all of these granulosa cells, or the cells of the follicles. So I think I also have them called just follicular cells. We won't worry about that distinction here. All right. Now, there's two more things that I want to point out to you. The first of these is that outside of the granulosa cells, you see this other dense layer of cells that are kind of surrounding the follicle. These cells forming the outer layer are what are actually known as thecal cells. And does anybody know what thecal cells do? Like I said, I know we haven't done the reproductive system, so it's okay if you don't know this, but they end up doing something interesting. It actually, what it does is thecal cells actually produce androgens. We normally think of androgens as being the male hormones, but what actually happens is that the thecal cells produce androgens, and then it is the granulosa cells, these follicular cells, that then actually convert the androgens into estrogens. So making an estrogen is kind of a two-step process. They're first made by the thecal cells. The thecal cells then give it to the granulosa cells, the follicular cells, which then convert it into convert it into estrogens. And among many of the things that those estrogens do is they mature that growing oocyte. All right. So we mentioned it before, so let's talk about this. What are some of the potential targets for estrogens in a female?
The ovaries.
Okay, excellent. The ovaries itself. And now we know why, because here in the ovaries, it is going to play an important role in maturing the oocyte. What else?
Mammary glands.
Excellent. They can play a role in the maturation of the mammary glands, right, causing those glands to mature, become capable of producing milk. Not producing milk, but maturing to become capable of it. What else?
The uterus.
Okay. What does it do to the uterus?
Maintains it.
Not a bad guess. It isn't so much that it maintains it, but you have the right idea. When we get to the female cycle, we'll talk about menstruation, where the lining of the uterus is shed as a result of changes in hormone levels. And so if it's going to be sloughing off those layers and releasing them from the body, they need to grow back. So it's going to play an important role in the regrowth of the uterine wall to help to bring that back. Absolutely.
Does it have anything to do with bones?
Not so much.
Growth of bones?
You are correct in that, as we know, estrogens, as we talked about in 430, they indeed stimulate our osteoblasts. So it isn't so much that they play a role in the bones growing, but they do play an important role in maintaining the density of the bone by getting those osteoblasts to put that calcium into the bone matrix, which is a really good thing that females have high estrogen levels for their entire life, right? Do females have high estrogen levels for their entire life?
No.
No. Females undergo a mystical, magical process known as
Menopause.
menopause, absolutely. And menopause is that stage where females, from a biological standpoint, become useless. I'm just kidding. But from a biological standpoint, they no longer are capable of producing offspring, right? So again, biologically, they can't produce offspring anymore. And so there are implications of that. But part of that process is that drop of that estrogen levels. and drops of estrogen levels affect our osteoblasts. So now suddenly their osteoblasts are not depositing calcium into the bone nearly as rapidly. So what disorder can happen to females, late stage females, elderly females, much more commonly than elderly males?
Osteoporosis.
Osteoporosis, absolutely, right? Poor grandma can drink a whole cow's worth of milk. If she doesn't have those that estrogen to stimulate the osteoblasts to deposit that into her bone, grandma could be losing bone density much, much faster than grandpa is. So one of the things that with osteoporosis, elderly women can do is actually take estrogen supplements to help to maintain that bone density. So yeah, absolutely. Stimulating those osteoblasts. So it isn't so much about making the bones grow. They're not getting bigger, but it's about maintaining that bone density. So you're absolutely correct about that. I can think of at least one more good one. Again, maturation of the mammary glands. Right, we talked about this is the feminizing hormone. It turns girl people into women people. So not only do you have, the maturation of the mammary glands, but secondary hairs. As we talked about, the widening of the hips, the enlargement of the fat pad on the mons pubis, right? These are characteristics that are associated with a reproductively viable female, right? To help show that biologically she is capable of producing offspring. All right. So again, I think we've hit on the big stuff there. Estrogens, again, is the class. Estradiol is the primary one, produced by those follicular or granulosa cells. For right now, you can use those terms interchangeably. We'll talk about that more when we get to the reproductive system. And what's going on? There we go. Targets are the ovaries, the uterus, the mammary glands. And again, the promotion of the oocyte, the development of the mammary glands, and the feminizing of the female body. Maturation, reproductive maturation of it. Again, we're just talking about biological processes here. All right. Now, how is this estrogen production regulated?
Hormonally
Okay.
via
Testosterone.
Not a bad guess, but let's think about this. Notice while these are also called the granulosa cells, they form the follicle. It is the follicular cells of the ovary that is producing these estrogens. So what hormone is responsible for, dare I say, stimulating these follicles to produce estrogens?
Follicle stimulating hormone.
Yeah, there you go. See how easy that is? So that follicle stimulating hormone produced by the anterior pituitary is how we hormonally control the production of estrogens. All right. Questions on that? All right. Now remember, follicle stimulating hormone was only one of the gonadotropins that was produced by the anterior pituitary. What was the other one?
Luteinizing.
Luteinizing hormone. And luteinizing hormone is responsible for two really important processes. Let's cheat and go to our whiteboard here for a second. And I'll just draw a real simple mature follicle there. So here's our follicle with the egg in it, and it swells and swells and swells and swells. And when it gets big enough, the anterior pituitary starts producing and releasing a massive spike of luteinizing hormone. And that massive spike of that massive spike of luteinizing hormone basically triggers two events. The first event it triggers is Ovaltine, right? What's going to happen as a result of this is that that follicle is going to burst and that egg is going to be released. So this thing is going to basically pop like a balloon. And as it pops like a balloon, right, we get the releasing of that, oops, change color. The releasing of that egg. So ovulation is one of the big, huge events that occurs from that huge spike of luteinizing hormone. But it's in its name, luteinizing hormone. It is going to luteinize something. Well, what the heck does luteinizing mean? Well, it turns out what it means is that these remaining follicular cells, these cells of the follicle that stayed behind, are going to get converted into a big, huge, massive glandular structure known as the corpus luteum. So luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation and it converts the follicle cells into a big glandular structure called the corpus luteum. So notice we go back to the pretty pictures from your textbook. Notice here, we can see an example of a nice mature follicle with that oocyte and that big fluid-filled antrum. However, notice this structure next to it. This structure next to it kind of looks like a popped balloon, because that's basically what the follicle is after it bursts. It bursts and releases the egg, the oocyte, and as a result, what we're left with is this structure that is converted into this big glandular organ. And at first, it'll kind of look like this ruptured balloon, but as these cells grow and expand, it can actually grow and expand to become this big, huge, massive, solid glandular structure. And that's what we're seeing here. This big, huge, massive glandular structure is a mature corpus luteum. Now, this corpus luteum started as follicular cells. So not surprising, the cells that are here will still make estrogens. Oops, that's not right. Will still continue to make estrogens, but remember, the egg has been released. When that egg is released, it is viable for about 24 hours. During that 24 hours, it is possible that it could be fertilized by a sperm. Producing what? What do we call it when the egg fertilizes a sperm? What's the single cell we're left with as a result of that?
Zygote.
A zygote, absolutely. Producing that zygote. It then takes that zygote 5 to 7 days to get down to the uterus, and a total of 7 to, in some cases, 10 days before it implants in the wall of the uterus. So that egg may only be viable for 24 hours, but it could take a week, week and a half before it implants in the uterine wall. So what that means is once that egg is released, the female's body needs to start putting out a big, huge warning signal saying, hey, we could be getting pregnant any second now. Get ready. And that's what the whole class of hormones, progestins, are. Progestins are the hormone class And of course, the most common one is progesterone, is the class of hormones that basically tell mom's body, get ready. We could be pregnant any second now. So one of the huge things it does is it is going to, remember before we were regrowing the uterine wall. Well, this is going to cause massive growth and glandularization and vascularization of the uterus, getting it ready for implantation from the egg. Again, it's going to lead to the maturation of the mammary glands. Often after ovulation, a female's breasts may be tender, and that tenderness comes from the swelling of those glands as they're maturing in anticipation of becoming pregnant. Right? It's this big, huge warning bell that's going off. We're pregnant, get ready. We're pregnant, get ready. And it does that for about 2 weeks. And if after about 2 weeks, you're not actually pregnant and that egg doesn't implant itself in the uterine wall, then what happens?
It throws it all away.
Yeah, sheds the wall and it starts all over again. This corpus luteum shrinks down and shrivels up into a little piece of scar tissue called the corpus albicans, and the whole process begins anew.
I have a question.
I have an answer.
Isn't there progesterone in birth control? And if so, why would you want to like tell your body that constantly?
Great question. So while that warning bell is going off, hey, we are pregnant, we're about to get pregnant, we are pregnant. If you are pregnant, do we want to be maturing the next follicle and getting ready for another ovulation?
No.
No,
So it
exactly.
holds off.
Exactly. So by tricking the body into thinking that it's pregnant, then essentially you're stopping the production and the release of an egg.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. No, in fact, the very first birth control pills, there are still some that are just progestins and progesterone, but the very first birth control pills were progestins, right? If females have no problem fertilizing the egg, but sometimes have a problem maintaining the pregnancy, so they often lose it early on, they may take progesterone supplements after fertilization has occurred to help to maintain that uterine wall so that the baby's able to implant. So yeah, we are using these hormones to, trick's not the right word, but basically manipulate the system to our advantage. Absolutely. You've absolutely got the right idea. So I think we went through all of this. Again, it is the corpus luteum that still produces estrogen, so it still has all the effects of the estrogens that we think as well. But as we mentioned, this is the warning bell to tell the body to get pregnant. If the body actually gets pregnant as the baby is developing, one of the things that will develop in the baby is, or not in the baby, but associated with the baby will be the placenta. The placenta basically is the glandular structure and vascular structure that feeds the baby and provides hormones for the baby's development and growth, as well as mom's development and growth. And again, would mom's body care whether the progestins came from the placenta or from the corpus luteum? No. So again,
No.
all the effects of it are going to be the same, regardless of whether it's from the ovaries or whether it's from the placenta. But again, this is that one that is going to promote and maintain pregnancy and help to mature those mammary glands to prepare for lactation. And again, we already gave it away. How, of course, is it regulated?
Hormonal via luteinizing hormone.
Exactly. The one point I want to emphasize on this is we really have just touched the surface. We're going to get into this in more depth when we get to the reproductive system. When we get to the reproductive system, one of the things that I like to talk about is it is the first true organ system where we see significant differences between the male and the female. I guess urinary would be another one, but the reproductive is the big one. Obviously, they both have the same goal: produce gametes, propagate the species, right? But it's the same thing as saying that all cars have engines and all engines do the same thing, right? If you've never studied an engine before in a car, you'd want to study that engine in the car to understand how it works. But if you've never studied an engine before, would you want to start with a 2022 Lexus, or would you want to start with that 1963 Volkswagen Bug?
The Bug.
The Bug. Both have engines that do basically the exact, well, do similar things, but one is much more basic and one is much more complicated. And that is exactly what the reproductive system is like. They both basically do the same thing, but you have the boys that are the 63 bugs, about as basic and simple as it can be. And the females are the 2022 Lexuses. Lexi? The plural of Lexus. Multiple Lexuses. Lexi? I like Lexi better. The 2022 Lexi that, I don't know if that's right, but I like it. Engine does the same thing, but way more bells and whistles, way more complicated. And it's going to be the same way here. So I appreciate that this might not be fully satisfying, but that's because we are whitewashing so much information on this and just really focusing on the basics of the hormones right now. We'll get a chance to get more in depth on this in the reproductive system when we get to it. All right. So that's a brief look ahead at what we're going to be doing for the female reproductive system, and most importantly for her hormones. Questions on that? All right, let's not forget about, oh, I lied. There are a couple more. So again, upon pregnancy, and again, we'll talk about all of these in more depth when we get to them, but I want to mention them a little bit here first. When pregnancy occurs, our placenta and also our ovaries to an extent are able to produce a hormone called inhibin. With a name like inhibin, what do you think it does?
It inhibits something.
It inhibits something, absolutely. And what it inhibits is actually those gonadotropins of the anterior pituitary. If you think about it, the gonadotropins of the anterior pituitary they regulate the rate of gamete formation, right? So again, for a female, that's basically one ovulation every 4 weeks. But that doesn't seem very efficient. If we can do one egg every 4 weeks, couldn't we do one every 2 weeks? One every 3 days? Wouldn't that be way more efficient? Isn't more better?
No,
No.
because you would run out of eggs faster.
True, that could be there, and there could be lots of other complications and issues. You're not having time to regrow the uterus to be able to form implantation, all these other things. So more isn't better. So while you want to have the right amount of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone to be able to control the maturation of the ovaries, you don't want it to go too fast. So inhibin is basically the ovary's way of telling the anterior pituitary, hey, you're releasing too many of these gonadotropins. We are developing our eggs too quickly, and that is not a good thing. So slow your roll. But we got to slow this process down. We're going too fast because faster isn't better, right? Especially when we're talking about reproduction. All right. Now, I'm curious, how do you think inhibin is regulated? So let's think about the process. Our anterior, here, let's actually write this out. We'll do this really simple. So here's the process. Our anterior pituitary is releasing, right, our follicle stimulating hormone. It is stimulating the follicle cells. And these follicle cells basically do two things. They are maturing the oocyte. But these follicle cells can also produce inhibin. And as we mentioned, that inhibin is going to inhibit production here. So if we have too much follicle stimulating hormone, what's going to happen to our inhibin production? Are we going to produce?
grow.
Yeah, we're going to produce more inhibin, which means we are going to inhibit the anterior pituitary more. And as a result of that, it releases less follicle stimulating hormone. What does that sound an awful lot like? What kind of regulation is this?
Negative feedback.
Close. You've got the right idea. We are getting too much of something, like we had too much glucose in the blood, and so then we wanted to bring glucose levels down. Or we had too much calcium in the blood, and so we wanted to bring calcium levels down. Well, now we have too much follicle stimulating hormone in the blood. So we're inhibiting the anterior pituitary to bring follicle stimulating hormone levels down. What kind of regulation is that?
Humoral.
Exactly.
And that would be via the follicle stimulating hormone.
Excellent. Remember, humoral is when you're counting the number of things that are in the blood. What's a little unique about this process is the thing that you're counting is a hormone. But in this case, you're still counting it. It's not that the hormone causes inhibin to be produced. It's that we're counting how much of that follicle stimulating hormone there is, and that is triggering a humoral response. So that's kind of a unique and interesting thing about that inhibin, is that it's not actually directly controlled by the hormone. It's instead counting the number of hormones. So it is actually a humoral response to something in the blood, and that something in the blood just happens to be follicle stimulating hormone. All right. While we're talking about females, there's one other important hormone we need to talk about, human chorionic gonadotropin. Remember, we talked about when that sperm and that egg come together, they form that zygote. And the cells of the, well, it's no longer a zygote at that point. I guess at that point, it's an embryo. The cells that once, let's say it this way. Once the cell is fertilized, it produces a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin. This hormone targets the ovaries and the uterus. The job here, among the many things that it's going to do, one of the big things it's going to do right here is it is going to maintain the corpus luteum. Remember, before I said the corpus luteum would shrink and become a little piece of scar tissue. And as it shrinks and produces and becomes scar tissue, does it continue to produce progestins? If your gland shrinks in half, do you think it's going to make the same amount of progestins that it did before?
No.
No. So what human chorionic gonadotropin does is it maintains the corpus luteum, which maintains a high level of progestins, which of course maintains the ovaries. Maintains the uterus, so that the uterus can continue to house and feed the growing baby. Now, human chorionic gonadotropin does far, far more than that as well. But for our purposes right now, we'll just focus on the fact that it is able to maintain that uterus for the 40 weeks necessary to then squirt that baby out. Hugely, hugely important process. And as I mentioned, that fertilized egg is the only thing that produces human chorionic gonadotropin. So as that one egg becomes 2, and those 2 become 4, and those 4 become 8, and that 8 becomes 100, and that bundle continues to grow and grow and grow, the amount of human chorionic gonadotropin produced grows and grows and grows. And in fact, the female, well, the egg, developing egg, will produce so much human chorionic gonadotropin that some of it starts leaving the body in the kidney. Why is that significant?
Is that how you test if you're pregnant? Through your urine?
Exactly. Since the only thing that produces human chorionic gonadotropin is a developing baby, then if you pee on a stick and that stick tests for human chorionic gonadotropin, if it finds human chorionic gonadotropin, then you are pregnant. Exactly. That's why women around the world pee on sticks, because of that human chorionic gonadotropin. All right. Questions on that? Obviously, this is produced by a developing baby, which is an incredibly complex process. So once again, we are not going to worry about how it's regulated. Okay. So this is going to be another one where I guarantee that won't be a question on the exam, because that's a far more complicated question than we could ask on a simple lab exam. There is one more hormone produced by the placenta that really has nothing to do with the baby and everything to do with mom. And that hormone is called relaxin. And what do you think relaxin does?
Relaxes her.
Exactly, which is any woman who's ever been pregnant knows pregnancy is an incredibly relaxing process where the woman is just totally chill all the time. Right?
False.
Okay, maybe
Does
not.
it allow for the relaxing of the skin so the stomach can grow?
Not just the skin, but the ligaments and tendons inside the abdominal pelvic cavity. So you guys have the right idea. It absolutely is relaxing, but it's relaxing is the internal organs, the ligaments and tendons that allow for that incredible expansion that has to take place in the female body to go from a single cell to a basketball in just 40 weeks. It requires a tremendous amount of relaxation and modification of the tendons and ligaments and connective tissues to make that accommodation. And once the body has undergone that once, it's much easier for it to undergo it a second time. So one of the things that commonly occurs is a female will often talk about how she showed much earlier with subsequent children, with the second child, than she did with the first. Is that because the second baby is growing faster than the first baby?
No.
No, it's actually just that the mom's body is accommodating more rapidly for the second pregnancy than it did for the first. Another important function of relaxin, as we learned back in 430, the pubic symphysis is a symphysis joint where fibrocartilage holds the two bodies of the pubic bones together, helping to form our pelvis. And that true pelvis is where you have to pass that basketball to get the baby out of you. So one of the things relaxin does is it loosens that fibrocartilage, giving that pubic symphysis more flexibility, more give, making it easier for the baby to pass. However, as we also learned in 430, that pelvis is your center of gravity. It's your base of movement. So typically a female who is in late term in her pregnancy, because of that loosening of the pubic symphysis, takes on a very distinctive gait to the way they walk. Notice I didn't say waddle, right? But so that very distinctive gait to the way that they walk. And all of that is because of that relaxin. Right? Basically, it has nothing to do with the baby and everything to do with getting mom's body ready to deal with essentially the traumas of pregnancy. And again, far, far too complicated of a process to worry about how that is controlled. So again, you can put a big X through that. The short answer for both of these is they're controlled hormonally, but we're not going to worry about how. So you can just put big X's through it. All right, questions on that? All right, one more major organ that we need to talk about, and that is, again, the boy version of the gonad, the testis. As we can see here, a single testis is compartmentalized into individual little lobules, somewhere between 250 and 300 individual compartments. Inside of these compartments are these twisted coiled tubes known as the seminiferous tubules. And each one of those is about 3 to 4 feet long. All right. Each one of these lobules has anywhere between 1 and 4 of these. So if you think about it, even if the average was 2 4-foot seminiferous tubules times the 300 compartmental lobules, right? If you think about that as a massive surface area for the production of sperm and for the production of our hormones. Right, if you think about it, if you took them out and laid them out end to end, it would hurt a lot. All right, let's take a closer look. And I know this picture is out of focus, but that's really okay because we don't really care. When we get to the reproductive system, we will talk about the seminiferous tubule. And basically in this seminiferous tubule, we are going from stem cells to sperm-shaped cells, immature spermatozoa, as they develop through the walls of this. This picture doesn't have a good example of one, a teeny one, but that's not a good one, so I don't even bother showing you. However, if you look at this, there's all these cells, and then notice in between the cells, there's all this kind of pink fuzzy stuff. This pink fuzzy stuff that is surrounding the cells are a special cell called a nurse cell or a sustentacular cell. They can often be easily identified because you will see that they have this diamond or triangular shaped nucleus that's kind of sitting in here. There's not really a good example of this. There's one, as I mentioned here. If you look very closely, you can see that there is a triangular shaped nucleus there. That's the nucleus of a Sertoli cell or a nurse cell, but I wouldn't use this one on the exam. It's not a good example. There's some where it's much, much more obvious. And so we'll worry about that there. But those are the nurse cells that have to support these cells as they grow, as they mature, as they become sperm shaped, and they protect them from the blood and the antibodies, because these cells are very different from the body cells. So we need to protect them as well. So these nurse cells, as the name indicates, provides that protection. However, what we care about are these cells that are here outside of the seminiferous tubules. In the connective tissue septums that surround these are our interstitial cells, or what are also known as the interstitial cells of Leydig, because good old Bob Leydig was the first one who planted his flag in there, which sounds incredibly painful. But it is these interstitial cells that are responsible for the function that we care about right now. And what we care about right now is the production of those androgens. As we know, the most common androgen is testosterone, but there are about a half dozen others. They are produced outside of the seminiferous tubule in that space of the connective tissues, that interstitial space, which has the interstitial cells. And as we kind of talked about before, this is the masculinizing hormone. So it leads to important function here, the maturation of the sperm. Notice I didn't say sperm production. If you produce 0 androgens, you can still make billions of sperm. However, they won't be functional. They will all be immature, and they will not be capable of fertilizing an egg. To become capable of fertilizing the egg, they need those androgens so that they can mature those sperm. Right? Increase in skeletal muscle, thickening of the mucus fold of our vocal cords, deepening the voice, secondary hairs, right? All of those masculizing sexual characteristics. And like I said, they mature the sperm. They're not responsible for the production of the sperm. Remember also, as someone mentioned this already, as we mentioned, females make all their gametes, all the eggs are actually produced in utero before they're born. Males don't start making theirs until after puberty. But unlike females who stop maturing them at menopause, and even in some cases essentially run out of eggs, males can basically continue to produce sperm till 15 minutes after they're dead. So you end up with plenty of people like Tony Randall producing children that he's far too old and weak to be able to pick up. All right. Pretty simple and straightforward process, but let's answer this question. How is androgen production regulated? So remember, testosterone rhymes with progesterone. So how are they both regulated? My microphone is turned on, right?
Hormonal.
There you go. Hormonally via I know it's late. I know it's long. We're almost done, I promise. But let's push our way through. Again, testosterone rhymes with progesterone, which I keep pointing out because they're both regulated the same way. And that is hormonally via.
Luteinizing hormone.
There you go. Luteinizing hormone. Remember, if you just say hormonally, you're only getting partial credit. You have to give, if it's hormonally, you have to give me the hormone. If it's humorally, you have to give me the thing that it's counting in the blood. And if it's neural, you have to tell me the part of the nervous system that's sending the signal. So there's two parts to all of those regulated questions. Excellent. And do males produce any special hormones that are going to play an important role in maintaining the pregnancy and keeping the baby alive?
No.
No.
Boys don't play any role in that. They do produce inhibin though. And the inhibin works in essentially the exact same way. Our anterior pituitary in males produces follicle stimulating hormone. In this case, though, it is stimulating those interstitial cells. And while the interstitial cells don't mature the oocyte, they do mature the sperm. Sorry, I don't mature the sperm. They make the sperm. We said that already. Sorry. And they don't, hold on. Was talking and not paying attention to what I was saying. Let's try this again. Follicle stimulating hormone, as we mentioned before, stimulates the seminiferous tubules. The seminiferous tubules make sperm. That is what follicle stimulating hormone does. But we also have the interstitial cells that produce inhibin, as well as androgens. Once again, like in females, these interstitial cells are going to be counting how much follicle stimulating hormone there is. And if there is too much, then we'll produce more inhibin to slow the process down to make sperm more slowly. The same way you can make eggs, mature eggs too quickly, you can make sperm too quickly as well. So as someone mentioned, we have both males and females have this negative feedback process to help to maintain not just the fast, but maintain the appropriate rate of gamete formation. And so notice both the interstitial cells and the follicle cells in females are regulated humorally by counting how much follicle stimulating hormone there is. So that is true in both males and females. All right, questions on that? All right, we did that. So we have hit most of our big organs. We still have a fair number of hormones we need to talk about. Most of these, there are things that we've talked about either earlier in 431 or actually way back in 430 as well. So hopefully some of this will be at least a little bit of a review. Hopefully the thymus gland, because it's actually this section where we talked about it, produces a hormone called thymosin. Thymosin is indeed a circulating hormone. However, even though it's a circulating hormone, what's the actual target of thymosin, do you think?
Lymphocytes?
Yeah, but lymphocytes housed where? What does the thymus do?
Matures lymphocytes?
Yeah, it makes them into T cells. And where does that take place? You guys are overthinking it. It's not a trick question. In the thymus, exactly. Even though it's a circulating hormone, it's basically targeting itself. Thymosin is a hormone that basically targets itself, right? In the thymus tissue itself. And of course, what does it do?
Matures lymphocytes?
Yeah, matures lymphocytes into T cells, right? Remember that process we called becoming immunocompetent. Capable of capable of attacking a pathogen. Excellent. Our pineal gland, located there in the back of the midbrain, right? It is your first chakra. It is your third eye. And if I remember my 430 correctly, it produces melatonin. Excellent. That's that thing that makes our skin dark. All right. Questions on that?
Wait, isn't that melanin?
Oh, yeah, wait, that's melanin. So what does melatonin do?
Makes you go sleepy.
Yeah, exactly. It helps to regulate our sleep-wake cycle. It actually targets the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and it regulates our sleep cycle. Right? Again, I know this is something that most of us don't get the opportunity to appreciate because I'm guessing most of the people here in this class didn't wake up this morning because they wanted to, right? Their alarm typically went off, or their kids yelled, or their dog barked, or some other type of social or other type of cue forced you to get up whether you wanted to or not. But if we were able to remove all those exterior cues, we do actually have a cycle for when we want to sleep, when we want to eat, when we want to wake up. And melatonin plays a huge role in regulating that process. That's why when you travel to New York for the weekend or France for the weekend, you end up jet lagged, right? You're ready to go out and party, and they're having lunch in the middle of their workday. Right, so we have those disparities in our cycles because of these differences in melatonin levels. Question: how is melatonin regulated?
Is it neural?
It is indeed neural. From where? Anyone remember? We did briefly talk about this in 430.
Was it eyes?
Yeah. Your pineal gland actually gets direct inputs from the retina. So we could say from the retina, or we could say it's regulated by light. As I mentioned, if you're traveling to New York or France for the weekend, the first morning you're there, get up at sunrise and just sit out on the balcony watching the sunrise for the first hour. And that sunlight that you take in the first hour of observing that will help to actually reset your melatonin levels. All right. Kids, people sometimes have difficulty sleeping at night if they're in a room that is too well lit. You're not able to get that deep sleep because that light interferes by producing melatonin. Well, really breaking down melatonin. So light plays a huge role in regulating the function of our pineal gland.
Professor, sorry, how is thymosin regulated?
Don't worry about it.
Oh, okay.
Again, it's part of our immune response, more complicated than we want to worry about. All right, a couple more. Again, most of these are ones we've already talked about or will talk about moving forward. Here's one that was on the exam that I don't think anybody got correct. What produces atrial natriuretic peptide?
The heart.
Yeah, the atria of the heart. In response to what?
Pressure increase.
Right. So remember, we talked about the blood coming back to the atria should be at 0 millimeters of mercury. If there is a positive pressure, that pressure stretches the atria, and the atria releases atrial natriuretic peptide. And what is atrial natriuretic peptide target?
The atria.
Not a bad guess, but nope. What was the target? Anybody remember?
Was it kidneys?
It was indeed the kidney, right? Because after all, you have too high blood pressure. It's causing your atria to stretch. So what do you want to tell the kidney to do?
Increase absorption
Of?
Sodium, so water can follow.
Yeah. Stop bringing back sodium, stop bringing back water, release more water. And so if we release more water, our blood volume goes down, our blood pressure goes down, and so our BP would decrease as a result of that. So when our atria stretch, we release atrial natriuretic peptide, which is going to decrease the blood pressure. Here's another one we've talked about, erythropoietin. Where is that produced again?
Kidneys.
Kidneys. What's its target?
Red blood cells.
Close.
Was it bone marrow?
We're going to make, exactly, we're going to make more red blood cells. That is definitely the effect. And so the target is our red bone marrow. Excellent. So we make more red blood cells and mature them more quickly. Here's one we just talked about earlier today. Where's calcitriol originally produced? Calcitriol is the active form of what again?
Vitamin D.
So where do we make vitamin D?
Skin.
Skin. Excellent. And what did we see calcitriol did?
Increases absorption of calcium.
From the
Digestive.
yeah, digestive system. So it targets the digestive system, primarily the small intestine, but just saying digestive system would be fine. And it increases calcium absorption. Excellent. Calcitriol is our first hormone we've talked about that are going to affect the digestive system. When we get to the digestive system has dozens of hormones that affect it, and it's far more complicated of a process that we're going to need to worry about for this exam. So gastrin, secretin, cholecystokinin, all of these are examples of hormones that are produced by the digestive system and regulate the digestive system. So as long as you know that these are 3 examples, along with calcitriol, you should understand the mechanism of this one. But for the rest of these, oh, we got to go back. For the rest of these, so for gastrin, secretin, and cholecystokinin, know that they are hormones made by the digestive system to regulate the digestive system. And as long as you know that, that is fine. We did all 3 of these because these are things we have talked about before. But what I realized we did not do for all of these is how they're regulated. So let's do that. How is atrial natriuretic peptide regulated?
Humoral via water.
I like that. It's a great way that you're thinking about it. Absolutely, because if there's more blood pushing on the walls of the atria, then that would be water inside of it. Absolutely. And you've got the right idea. However, what it actually is stretch receptors. So you could say it's regulated by the pressure of the blood, which obviously is related to that, or because it's stretch receptors, you could say that it's neural, regulated neurally by the walls of the atria. Something like that would be fine. What about erythropoietin? Anybody remember how this one's regulated? What triggered the production of erythropoietin?
The level of red blood cells in the blood.
True, but what do those red blood cells do?
Is it oxygen?
Exactly. Notice you could have the right number of oxygen of red blood cells, but if they didn't have enough hemoglobin in them, then you still wouldn't be able to carry enough oxygen, right? So what it's really looking at is oxygen levels in the blood. And of course, that would be humoral. And what about calcitriol?
Is it humoral via calcium?
There you go. Excellent. I believe your last hormone on your list is leptin. Where's leptin produced?
fat.
Yeah, it's produced in fat. What, any idea what it targets? Or what it does? I'll give you the hard one. It targets the hypothalamus. And yes, absolutely. One of the effects is it gives you the sense of cessation or the sense of feeling full. Man, when they first found this, the researchers who found this thought they had hit the jackpot. Now we have this magic pill. I can just give you a leptin pill. You're going to feel full. You're not going to eat. And when you don't eat, you're going to lose all your weight and be beautiful on the outside, which, as we know, is the only thing that matters in the world. And everybody's going to now be beautiful and they're going to be filthy rich. All from figuring out that leptin makes you feel full. So what the heck happened?
It didn't work.
It didn't work. Why not?
Did ghrelin play a part in that?
True, but there's even a simpler answer than that.
Does it just help you to more so maintain, like stay the same?
Sort of. But how many of you only eat when you're hungry and always stop when you're full?
It didn't help the emotional, mental part of eating.
Yeah, absolutely. There was that part of it. Also, what they found, the short answer is what they found is feeling sated has almost no effect on people's eating habits, right? You ate breakfast today at 9:30 because that was the point where you were able to get the kids out to school. You got to take care of X, Y, and Z, and that is where you had your free time. Or you had lunch at 1 because that's when you're given your break at work, right? Or you eat because you're angry or because you're bored or because you're sad, right? Eating because you're hungry, not eating because you're feeling full, has almost no effect on when people and why people eat and how much they eat and all those things. So while, yes, it plays a role in that, it really has a limited effect on influencing someone's overall diet. And so, yeah, no, it didn't have that kind of effect. Now, that doesn't mean that leptin doesn't serve some still very important roles. In fact, as we'll see, it plays a huge role in females in helping to start and maintain menstruation. Right? I might not have thought of it in these terms, but maybe some of you know some of these extreme athletes, some of these endurance athletes who, for a fun weekend will run 100 miles during the course of a weekend. And some of these women will get down to a point where they get to like 0.5% body fat as a result of that. And what can often happen with these types of extreme athletes when they get down to that incredibly low body fat levels? Yeah, the menstrual cycle can actually stop as a result of that. Right? Leptin is one of the ways the female body tells the ovaries, tells the anterior pituitary that I am physically healthy enough to be able to carry a baby for 40 weeks to full term. And having adipose storage is one of the ways that shows that the body is healthy and capable of the huge metabolic needs necessary. So when adipose levels drop significantly, it can actually lead to a disruption of menstruation. All right, excellent. I think that's it. That is everything you need to know for this exam. All right, with the exception of our group presentations. But again, group presentation probably be 1 essay question, 2 or 3 lab questions. So it's not going to be a huge part. We've done most of the heavy lifting now. So any questions on any of that? All righty. Well, if everybody's quiet, then I am done. This is all the material that you're responsible for. We can finish early. If you want to use this time to, again, the remaining time to meet with your group, talk to them, discuss the things that you're working on, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, the class is yours. Remember, tomorrow, 6 p.m. Don't wait till the last minute. Get your outlines in. Here, I'm going to actually peek right now. See how many people, if anybody has turned in their outlines. 5 of them. Excellent. We have 9 groups. Looks like 5 of them turned them in so far. Excellent, excellent, excellent. For the other